Hi, this is Alan. I'd just like to say a few words as to how the website has been received and how information has affected some people, different types of people in different ways, and it might be appropriate to give a few comments on this particular website of mine. I put this up really not with the intention of going along with any mainstream popular movement. I don't really like popular movements, since popular movements, as Plato said, are given from the top down for the people to follow. Rather, this particular website could be an example for other people who are individuals who can see that the king has no clothes, so to speak, and may want to emulate this kind of website for themselves by informing themselves of what really is happening in their life, what's behind it, the techniques that are used to motivate people into mass movements, different kinds of mind control. We tend to think of mind control as being really a one-on-one thing of kidnapped people by spies and so on. But in reality, the easiest form of mind control is generated from basically governmental institutions via media and propaganda. It's the most ancient technique that's ever been used, and why change it when it works so well? Always. If you have 1 million people taught that the earth is flat, and you train them all to believe in this, then obviously the norm in that society would be to say that the earth is flat. If one person says, wait a minute here, I've proven by my own investigations that it's impossible to be flat, then all the rest of the people will think he's crazy. Well, that's because it's easier to influence the bulk of the population than it is to get to a thinking individual with his own inquiry. So this website has been received very, very well by listeners from all over, and I've really been very, very busy on a one-to-one basis with many individuals, giving them extra information as to books, research they can go into to try and pick up the trail of this ancient plan, an organized plan which can be followed all down through history. Even professors in university talk about it in different terms. Some of them used to call it manifest destiny, and it's odd that they always knew who we were sort of going, even though they were rather vague about the techniques employed. The Hindus may have a point when they say that man's biggest problem really is his own intellect, because we have the ability to be sentient and aware. Most people don't really use that. They're quite happy to be downloaded by mass media and popular movements with its mass production print machines. But truly enough, the very fact that we ask the whys gives us the problem of trying to stumble through and find the solutions to our problems. We see through a glass darkly, as they say, and that's never been any different in any era. The difference being perhaps that those at the top have access to archives of information, which is different from public libraries. Archives are full of techniques of control which have been used over thousands of years. Information is never destroyed. It's simply removed to other quarters, and then the old libraries are burned. Master dictators and tyrants don't destroy information. They steal it and hide it for themselves, because knowledge is power. And when you want to retain power over people, you don't share it with them. You give them false leads, endless leads, and the people, sure enough, will pick up the paper trails and go in circles forever. That's what you do. You steal knowledge and hide it. And that's how all knowledge is given out in public libraries. You can go through so many hundreds and hundreds of books, dry, dreary books by ex-bureaucrats and ex-politicians and ex-bankers and so on, and to find one paragraph within every book that puts on the light switch. Everything else in the book you could throw away. And those people know this. This is the technique of scattering knowledge. It's deliberate. You will never get a single book with all of the answers contained within. And that's deliberate too. Now, the few people who have complained at all really are not complaining about the knowledge I'm giving out. What they're really saying by their complaints, by the form that their complaints take, is that I'm not touching on the space aliens, or I'm not touching on the reptilians, you know. And that, again, is a form, or they'll say I'm not touching on the New Age, their favorite addiction, you might say. And I do touch on these things if they really do listen and go through all the free stuff I've given out there for them to listen to, if they have the patience. Most New Agers want instant gratification, and they simply jump from one teacher or guru to the next, and they pay their money, and they never complain. They never say they've been had. They simply devour what they're given, never understanding it generally anyway, and then go on to the next gulp somewhere else. And that's called, shopping for religion. And I'm sure there's thousands of websites out there where they can go shopping for that. In the Kabbalah, of course, they talk about the Ein Sof, which is the endless, and that's what you have for the New Age shoppers. It's fine for a hobby, if nothing else to occupy themselves with. But while they're shopping for the New Age and an answer to their spiritual crisis, they fail to realize that this is a world where spirit meets matter. And what happens in the world of matter, since you wake up as you every day, presumably, except for the reptilians, of course, then what you do here in the world of matter is important. The trick that's been used in ancient civilizations was to convince the public that nothing was real at all, you see. And once you convinced them of that, you've dominated them. Because whatever you do to them doesn't matter, since nothing's real. And that's the usual spiel of psychological warfare, which is put out by certain individuals even today, on behalf of the big boys. It's so easy to control vast civilizations and populations. Whenever you do anything to them, it doesn't matter because nothing's real, it's all illusion. An illusion, by definition, is really, it's not a hallucination. An hallucination is not real at all, you see. That's what it means. An illusion is a distortion of reality. So we should be very clear on the terms that are used. And people who are taught that this is not really happening, and all the nasty things are not really happening, can retreat into their Ein Sof and go on forever, or at least as long as the ones who control the physical allow it, because that's what it boils down to. I've never ceased to be amazed at the people who always ask the questions about the afterlife. When they're living in this one, they can't even deal with this one. And as Socrates said, they're not content about putting laws on the physical world. Here they are putting laws on the spiritual world as well. That's the folly of man. And so they go on and on in their hunt, the endless, allowing monsters to formulate the future for a few very wealthy elite families who have this knowledge and have hundreds, if not thousands, of think tanks working for them. And since they conjure up the money and have convinced us all that they have the actual right to rule and run this system of money, they've got it all sewn up because it's their system, you see. When money talks, morality walks. So for those who simply want to ask endless questions about something they can never prove to their own satisfaction, I would suggest that they go on and follow the movement that was revived or resuscitated from Theosophy, a masonically run organization chartered by the British Crown to alter the world to come for the 20th century. It sort of faltered off through the scandals that came out afterwards on Madame Blavatsky and the various frauds that she committed. But it was revived again in the 1960s by a big movement called Pop. Pop was father, of course. It was followed by rock and this masonry. And out of nowhere burst this new pop music. That's the general view. And in reality, it didn't burst out by itself. It was simply unleashed at the right time. And the charge took back into the New Age, which again is the name of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry's magazine, their journal. And they prophesied they'd do this back in the 1950s in their journals. Out came the Beatles. And the Beatles, of course, came out with what was going to be given to the public. And that which was given to the public as a diffusion of the mind, a diffusion of reason, was the land that had been used successfully in India for thousands of years. A basic form of theosophy blended with Christianity and other religions. This is contained in the following song. 1960s, all over countries in Europe especially, songs just burst out, such as Roger Whittaker's song, New World in the Morning. That was rather typical of the New Age message, that something, they always tell you that something wonderful is going to happen. This is the same phrase that was used in Arthur C. Clarke in the movie 2001 and 2010, where the man who reaches godhood, that's really what it's about. It's nothing to do with space at all, if you understand high masonry. He comes back and tells people that something wonderful is going to happen. And this is tied in with the age of Aquarius, which really has nothing to do, once again, with the popular New Age belief, simply because they've never done their homework into what Aquarius is all about, or the occult. They follow the standard books from the bookstores. They eat them up like a goat eats grass in a field, clump by clump, never asking, well, how come all these books just appear on the shelves for them to consume? They've never done any homework, you see. They are the consumers of religion. The Illuminati, at least the branch that stuck its head up in history during Weishaupt's era, and that was only one branch of what was already a European-wide and American-wide society. It had been on the go for hundreds and hundreds of years under different terms and names and so on. But under Weishaupt's charge, they formed what they called reading societies out throughout Europe. And the goal of the reading societies was, under the guise of helping the working people to read, and they then formed discussion groups. And then when you have discussion groups, the material which you're given to read becomes very important, because when you standardize the reading material, then you're standardizing thought and conclusions, and you're creating a movement towards a particular direction. And out of those actual reading societies was to come publishing houses. And if you go back over the last 200-300 years up to the present time, and just look out how many of the big mainstream publishing houses has the little lantern as its logo. The illumined ones, you see, are the ones who started off these reading societies, because being a form of computer, a human being can only parrot what is downloaded with. And you come to the conclusions which the programmer, the one who gives out the material, knows that you must reach. You shape the mind. Masonry shapes society. It shapes the mind. It sculpts it basically in a direction. And that is the whole method of controlling the public. You standardize things through mainstream. Mainstream comes from the underground stream, which they called this current of teaching, this thought process, this underground movement from the Rosicrucian era of the 1500s onwards, the underground stream. So they shape the form and content of your thought. And by limiting you or directing you along certain lines of thinking with limited access to knowledge, you must come to the conclusions which they know you must come to. A computer programmer does the same thing. A good programmer who designs a computer and its program, its language that it runs on, will know what conclusion, by feeding in the language, the data, that computer must reach on any particular problem. And humans work exactly the same. So out they came with the New Age, revived. The people behind it jumping into reincarnation, which is a natural thing to jump into. It's so ancient. It's a wonderful idea that you can keep coming back and work off your bad deeds and sort of evolve, you see. And of course, evolution is at the heart of very high occult Freemasonry. Only at the very high levels, they are completely into the belief of physical regeneration through interbreeding in order to gain the perfect spirit to inhabit the body, whereas commoners who pick their mates at random, that's why they're called commoners, they're not arranged marriages, then they end up with this what they call a hit and miss type of offspring. Once in a while you get someone who's fairly bright, maybe even a genius, but generally it's the lesser types that they call commoners, whereas the elite ones, including the scientific groups that have been going on down through the ages, literally interbreed their own offspring to be scientists. You'll see the same thing in the acting communities, where for multi-generations, the actors that one generation sees are just the sons and daughters of the previous generation's actors. And that's standard with most culture creation parts of the control mechanism of society. So in the 1960s, out came the New Age, just bang, books were on the shelves everywhere. Lucid, LSD, if you speak it, it's lucid. Just happened to be thrown over by the sackfuls over university walls all over Europe, generally out of big limos. And it wasn't until years later it was found out that the main societies that were dishing this stuff over the walls were basically government MI5, MI6 type societies. And then, of course, many books came out much, much later telling us that Victor Rothschild, the one exception to the banking family, he did go into banking eventually, but he was a scientist and he was experimenting on various MI5 agents with LSD at Porton Downs warfare facilities in England. And you can find that in Peter Wright's book, Spycatcher. So the big corporations, the big drug companies were behind the first manufacturing of LSD to get the tripping, the day tripper, you see. As the Beatles sung the song, the day tripper, to get the tripping going. A tripping is a movement devised to make a person stumble. You trip. And that's what it was. You break the stride of people who are going in a direction. You trip them up. And you land where you may. You have a day trip. These societies that were dishing out the drugs all over the place also put out their front men to propagandize the wonders of LSD. And the government-controlled BBC of England was at the spearhead of this, since they were the only station at the time in Britain. And they had all these sudden teenage programs on rock music, or pop music as they call it there. And they had these older guys aging that would be the DJs and act like children, and lots of go-go dancers to ensure that the guys watched it, of course. And then they would interview the occasional supposed star that was hanging off a chair somewhere, or trying to hang on to a chair, and mumble some strange answers from very direct questions, because they were generally stoned. And then they would look at the camera and they'd all laugh and giggle and say, "Aren't we naughty?" And that, of course, helped get all the youngsters who watched this in to get into the idea that, by God, this must be good stuff, because these guys are approving it. And that's how they got the whole thing going. And that was to destroy the old system. The old system had been kept going up into World War II with, God, King, Country, that type of stuff. And it had served its purpose. Now it was time to bring in the New Age. And high masonry, not the bottom stuff, but high masonry forms. A mason forms things. They shape society. That means that all the control mechanisms over society are reformed, reshaped, like building a new cathedral. And once you build a new cathedral, you dismantle the old. It has served its purpose. The New Age saw massive changes. Promiscuity was pushed to the hilt. They'd worked fervently since the 1920s to bring out a birth pill, and of course penicillin to cope with the venereal diseases that came out. And abortion started making its appearance. So promiscuity to destroy the family unit, to destroy possibility of long-term marriage. Everybody who grew up in those days had a big number done on their head. And you can see the fallout today, because society, as far as relationships go, is pretty well completely dysfunctional. No one escaped it. No one. So, for those who aren't hearing what they want to hear, which is the praise of the New Age and the explanations of mysteries, don't bother to teach because they don't have the patience to learn. They can gobble up as many books as they wish. There's an endless plethora dished out every year, actually every month. It's big business, and like someone with a bottomless stomach, their appetite is endless because there is no satisfaction in what to consume. And the impatient can't be taught anything. I would advise them to do what the Beatles said to do, to join the tour, because that was the beginning of the Magical Mystery Tour. That was the meaning of the Magical Mystery Tour. So for all those aboard the Magical Mystery Tour, consume as much as you want, whatever you want, and listen to the song of the Beatles who are put out there to promote it. This Magical Mystery Tour has been tried many times, over and over again. It was tried in the 1920s and 30s during the Great Depression. The great word, when it's put between a person's name or before a person's name, or a war or a depression, is a Masonic term. They love the great, like Alexander the Great, you see. The little pricks of light which shape history down through the darkness of time. And so we can see the connection between the drug culture being thrown out in the Great Depression, along with prohibition, to get the youth into the booze cans, the underground booze cans, where it was exciting and naughty, you see. And actually, after they brought prohibition off, they had way more drinkers than they had before it, because they made it popular to go into these little dives, you see. And where you'd hear the jazz and the miniskirt that they tried in the 1920s with the Charleston dance and so on. That was all part of the introduction of a system which failed because they didn't have a system in place to take care of the aftermath, the fallout of too many children, unwanted pregnancies, venereal disease, and of course even rehab clinics for all the drug addicts and alcoholics. So they put it back, and they went back to the drawing board and worked steadily for years to get the pill. And with the pill, they introduced at the same time the drug culture that was revived again. That's why the religion that runs all religions at the top is called the perennial religion. It keeps popping up down through time. It's the same one. And we can find in the 1960s, for instance, they came out with Timothy Leary, who always wore a white coat, showing that he was the scientist, and he'd give stage appearances, and he wrote books on the wonders of drugs, and how it expanded the mind. And this was pushed down the throats of the young people who just gobbled it up eagerly, you see. He's an older guy, a scientist, no doubt, telling you that drugs were wonderful for you, that expand your brain and do wonderful things for you, give you great experiences. He wasn't the only one put out there. It's interesting, too, to bring his name down to the Masonic coding, because it's the Tim is time, you see. And you also have Leary. Leary in Britain was the man who went round lighting the gas lamps in the streets at night in the 1800s. So he's another little reference to the Illuminati, a little tongue-in-cheek high Masonic joke. And he was one of many put out there to promote that. Now, Aldous Huxley was another one who was conjured up a long before, from a long lineage of high Freemasonry, going back to his ancestor Thomas Huxley, who was a friend of Charles Darwin, And Darwin's theory was nothing more than basically the exoteric version of the religion of Freemasonry, high Freemasonry, put out there under the guise of a scientific theory. Because in the high religion, evolution of all species up to man and to the next step of man is all part of the inner secret religion. It's been here forever. All down through history, since Babylon, we've seen the signs and symptoms of this disease that controls society and brings out the worst in humanity, as it controls all of humanity. And the MO is always the same. You have a group who control the banking and the money. That's essential for the system. It all rests on money. Everyone works for money, not for food. It's money that controls the whole system. You have the largest cities, wherever they move, the largest cities, to control empires like the world empire and the empire state. The financial capitals of the world, where the richest people live amidst the most squalor of poverty all around them. That's part of their MO. Mass prostitution, the illicit scene, so the legal is run by them, the legal system above, the illegal below, as above, so below. They run both sides of everything. They keep the people in check by using a form of police forces. In ancient times it was the military. Today we call them police. And this keeps the people, the public, under all of the rules of law that are enforced from the top under the guise of fighting crime. And of course the big boys control both sides of it. The mafia is only one branch of Freemasonry, and you'll find that the man who Albert Pike designated to take over from him was Giuseppe Mazzini. Mazzini is just Italian for Mason, and he gave the authorization and charter for the mafia to start up. So they're all interconnected, as above, so below, legal, illegal. It's all one and part of the same system. So prostitution, drugs, gambling. They also have the legal drug industry, pharmacology. They run that side too. The illegal drugs, to keep the people spaced out, is run by them. The same MOs, as I say, the same symbols too. And they also, wherever they go, they bring a mystery religion that's sold through symbols and talismans and magic writings, etc. Wherever they go, to intrigue the peoples around them, that then are formed into groups or sects who end up serving a purpose which they don't even understand, really. But for most people, it's not really necessary that they understand. They just want to believe they're involved in some great mysterious cause. Going back to Aldous Huxley, he gave a speech at Berkeley University to do with the wonders of drugs and electronic control of the brain through possible implants or wires in the brain. Anything which would take away what he said, this incredible loneliness and anxiety that everyone feels, this apartness. And this is again going back to the Masonic doctrine of oneness. We're all one. That's what they teach you. They themselves at the top don't believe that they're all one, but they tell you down below that we're all one. That way we act like a school of fish, you know. A school of fish all move at the same time in the same direction. They are, in a sense, one. That's not what human beings are all about. But they will have us all move in the same direction, and that makes it easier to control. So Huxley, who worked in Tavistock Institute and worked as a propagandist for the New World Order, promoting mind expansion drugs, was put out there to go around and encourage teenagers and to try the drugs. And he'd talk at Ivy League universities, because he was talking more honestly there about the real purpose of his mission, because at Berkeley, the faculties who were listening to them and the students were the ones who would be part of the controlling bureaucracies of to come. So they were far, far more honest on their real mission in talks like the one he gave at the Berkeley University. Huxley himself, it should be remembered, died in his wife's arms after taking an overdose of mescaline and LSD. So whether he saw Lucy in the sky with diamonds or the great god of South America, who knows? But it didn't do him a lot of good in the end. The sad tragedy of all of this is that so many people have died with the promotion of drugs by an occultic group at the top, very wealthy occultic group, who finance all sides of every war, knowing who they've chosen to be the victor before the wars even start, always as part of a plan towards a greater empire, a world empire. Those who struggle in the wars never figure that out. They're caught up in the emotion. And as soon as one side loses some comrades, then the whole country's up, because they rely on tribal instinct to take over. And yet, Professor Anthony Sutton did incredible investigations into all of this. He found the sources. He detailed the sources of who financed Hitler. And he also put out Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution to show you that the same big boys, big corporations, and people behind the corporations financed the Bolsheviks or Soviet system. And Germany would never have risen under Nazism without this aid. It wouldn't have had the reason to rise up as it did. And everyone knew that Germany had two ways out of its problems after World War I, because it was paying all of its money out in reparations. The people were starving. And it either fought its way out of it, or it died. And millions would have died. They knew this when they signed the Versailles Treaty in World War I. Everyone knew it. Communism had been agitating since 1917 in Germany for a revolution. Without communism or Bolshevism, you would never have seen the rise of a Hegelian opposition, the Nazi Party. And both sides were financed fully by the same corporations of the West, who still run things today in the West. Huxley and others never talked about the downside of drugs. You don't, to get new converts, you don't want to tell them about the side effects, what it does to you, or the endless amount of people end up in mental hospitals in the 60s and the 70s, and still today, who are now classified as basically drug-induced schizophrenics. Their brains are so fried. And this was a great experiment in mind control over the public, the youth of the public. And when you're under drugs, but you think you can handle, of course you're taught that you can handle them. And we have egos when we're young. We have no common sense. We've all been there. When you're under the influence, you don't make rational decisions. You not only don't make rational decisions, you don't notice the big changes that are happening in the world around you, which will affect you later on and everyone else around you. These are the big movements and political movements that are busy signing laws and treaties and so on. And that's part of keeping you out of the loop. So drugs are very handy for for once again doing what the Hindus did. Nothing's real, nothing matters except me and my spirit. And you're classified as disabled, really. You're not participating in the creation of destiny for yourself or others. You're out of the loop. You're navel-gazing or counting your toes over and over. In the 20s, when they brought out the drugs and the booze, big time, with the miniskirts, with the dancing, and with the music to match it, they call it jazz, they had songs burst out to promote it, as they always do, to the glory of drugs, you see. And the big boys, like the Bronfmans who were into the whiskey trade, and the Kennedys and many others who made their fortunes from prohibition, also were dealing with the smuggling of cocaine, drugs, to get everyone hooked, you see. And Luke Jordan was probably the first who came out in 1927 with Cocaine Blues, and that popularized, once again, how naughty we are, as youngsters like to think. Let's try this naughty cocaine. And he sang about it floating all around your brain. That was revised again when they hit us with the same stuff under the revamped New Age in the 1960s. I know Bob Dylan did a version of Cocaine Blues. Others did it too. Nick Drake did it. And then, of course, we had Simon Garfunkel, who came out with one of the most beautiful songs that everybody sang and hummed along to and whistled to in the days when they used to whistle. And it's called Bridge Over Troubled Waters. Most people listen to songs on a subliminal, subconscious level. They're downloaded with words and ideas and symbols which they never rationally or consciously think about, but it works on them inside. And Bridge Over Troubled Waters was nothing to do with a woman or anything like that. It was to do with the needle for heroin. The bridge over troubled waters was a shot of heroin going into the arm. Why would multi-million-dollar industries, knowing that these entertainment industries, as Plato said, well over 2,300 years ago, these industries in his day, he knew, were used for the creation and alteration of culture. Why would multinational, multi-million-dollar industries be promoting and be allowed to promote drugs to the youth? Where was the other side of the story? The fallout from all of this? The burned out ones, the dead ones, the people jumping out of buildings thinking they could fly, or walking into lakes and drowning after rock concerts. There was no outcry because that was the agenda. And that's why the top gives culture. That's why you'll see the Beatles being knighted. That's why the Rolling Stones get knighted. Why would you knight people who promoted the drug culture? The era of promiscuity with its massive fallout on families, disease, abortions. Why would you give the high awards of the country to these people? Well, you get them because the ones at the top of the country wanted that to happen. It was on the cards. It was not spontaneous. Huxley should be listened to in the upcoming speech he gave at Berkeley a mover and shaker working for one of the most advanced mind control institutions on the planet, talking and giving away what is allowed to give away, saying the most incredible things in the nicest possible way, in a captivating way. So you can think, my God, this man's really nice and human and pleasant, and you can even joke with him. Yet here he is talking about what's the problem about introducing a new soma drug into society if it keeps them happy and quiet and peaceful. What's the problem about putting wires into people's brains to give them peace? What he never touches on, but what he is well aware of. And the question he will not ask, therefore, is why are people so anxious and unhappy? Because since he came from the ruling elite classes, the aristocracy, the man even speaks with a 19th century accent of the upper elite. What he never mentions is that the system they had created is not intended to give you peace. You control masses of people by keeping them ill at ease. So here is the thesis again, the Hegelian dialectic. The thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. Here's the problem. Here's what you do to fix the problem. Here's the thing that comes out of the blending of the two together. So listen to his words carefully. And you'll probably like the man, because that's his job, is to make you like him. While he tells you the most amazing things that he and others would like to do to society. He talks about a scientific dictatorship and lists the reasons why he thinks it would succeed. Where the old Illuminati experts running everything would run your life and you'd never know and you'd be quite happy because you couldn't think anymore, basically, as an individual. So listen carefully to the upcoming talk beginning now.
University in its capacity as a Ford research professor. Mr. Huxley has recently returned from a conference at the Institute for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara, where the discussion focused on the development of new techniques by which to control and direct human behavior. Traditionally, it is impossible to suppress individual freedom through the application of physical coercion, through the appeal of ideologies, through the manipulation of man's physical and social environment, and more recently through the cruder techniques of psychological conditioning. The ultimate revolution about which Mr. Huxley will speak today concerns itself with the development of new behavioral controls which operate directly upon the psychophysiological organisms of man, that is, the capacity to replace external constraint by internal compulsion. As those of us who are familiar with Mr. Huxley's works well know, this is a subject with which he has been concerned for quite a period of time. Mr. Huxley will make a presentation of approximately half an hour, followed by some brief discussions and questions by the two panelists sitting to my left, Ms. Lillian Rivlin and Mr. John Post. Mr. Huxley.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that the conference at Santa Barbara was not directly concerned with the control of the mind. That was a conference that has been two open now at the University of California Medical Center in San Francisco. One this year, which I didn't attend, and one 2 years ago, where there was a considerable discussion on this subject. At Santa Barbara, we were talking about technology in general and the effects it's likely to have on society and the problems related to technological transplanting of technology into underdeveloped countries. Well, now, in regard to this problem of the ultimate revolution, this has been very well summed up by the moderator. In the past, we can say that all revolutions have essentially aimed at changing the environment in order to change the individual. I mean, there's been the political revolution, the economic revolution, in the time of the Reformation, the religious revolution. All these aimed, as I say, not directly at the human being, but at his surroundings, so that by modifying the surroundings you did achieve, at one remove, an effect upon the human being. Today, we are faced, I think, with the approach of what may be called the ultimate revolution, the final revolution, where a man can act directly on the mind-body of his fellows. Well, needless to say, some kind of direct action on human mind-bodies has been going on since the beginning of time. But this has generally been of a violent nature. The techniques of terrorism have been known from time immemorial, and people have employed them with more or less ingenuity, sometimes with the utmost crudity, sometimes with a good deal of skill acquired by a process of trial and error, finding out what the best way of using torture, imprisonment, constraints of various kinds. But as I think it was Masonic said many years ago, you can do everything with bayonets except sit on them. That if you are going to control any population for any length of time, you must have some measure of consent. It's exceedingly difficult to see how pure terrorism can function indefinitely. It can function for a fairly long time, but I think sooner or later you have to bring in an element of persuasion, an element of getting people to consent to what is happening to them. Well, it seems to me that the nature of the ultimate revolution with which we are now faced is precisely this, that we are in process of developing a whole series of techniques which will enable the controlling oligarchy, who have always existed and presumably always will exist, to get people actually to love their servitude. This is, seems to me, the ultimate in malevolent revolution, shall we say. And this is a problem which has interested me for many years, and about which I wrote 30 years ago a fable, The Brave New World, which is essentially the account of a society making use of all the devices at that time available, and some of the devices which I imagined to be possible, making use of them in order to, first of all, to standardize the population, to iron out inconvenient human differences, to create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system. And since then I have continued to be extremely interested in this problem, and I have noticed with increasing dismay that a number of the predictions which were purely fantastic when I made them 30 years ago have come true, or seem in process of coming true, that a number of techniques about which I talked seem to be here already, and that there seems to be a general movement in the direction of this kind of ultimate revolution, this method of control by which people can be made to enjoy a state of affairs which, by any decent standard, they ought not to enjoy. This is the enjoyment of servitude. Well, this process, as I say, has gone on for over the years, and I become more and more interested in what is happening. And here I would like briefly to compare the parable of Brave New World with another parable which was put forth more recently in George Orwell's book, 1984. Orwell wrote his book between 45 and 48, at the time when the Stalinist terror regime was still in full swing, and just after the collapse of the Hitlerian terror regime. And his book, which I admire greatly, is a book of very great talent and extraordinary ingenuity, shows, it's so to say, a projection into the future of the immediate past, of what for him was the immediate past, and the immediate present. It was a projection into the future of a society where control was exercised wholly by terrorism and violent attacks upon the mind body of individuals. Whereas my own book, which was written in 1932, when there was only a mild dictatorship in the form of Mussolini in existence, was not overshadowed by the idea of terrorism, and I was therefore free in a way which Orwell was not free to think about these other methods of control, these non-violent methods. And I'm inclined to think that the scientific dictatorships of the future, and I think there are going to be scientific dictatorships in many parts of the world, will be probably a good deal nearer to the Brave New World pattern than to the 1984 pattern. They will be a good deal nearer, not because of any humanitarian qualms in the scientific dictators, but simply because the Brave New World pattern is probably a good deal more efficient than the other. That if you can get people to consent to the state of affairs in which they are living, the state of servitude, the state of being, having their differences ironed out and being made amenable to mass production methods on the social level, if you can do this, then you are likely to have a much more stable, a much more lasting society, a much more easily controllable society than you would if you were relying wholly on clubs and firing squads and concentration camps. So that my own feeling is that the 1984 picture was tinged, of course, by the immediate past and the present in which Orwell was living, but that the past and present of those years does not represent, I feel, the likely trend of what is going to happen. Needless to say, we shall never get rid of terrorism. That will always find its way to the surface. But I think that insofar as dictators become more and more scientific, more and more concerned with a technically perfectly running society, they will be more and more interested in the kind of techniques which I imagined and described from existing reality in Brave New World. So that it seems to me then that this ultimate revolution is really not very far away, that we already a number of the techniques for bringing about this kind of control are here, and it remains to be seen when and where and by whom they will first be applied in any large scale. And first, let me talk about a little bit about the improvement even in the techniques of terrorism. I think there have been improvements. Pavlov, after all, made some extremely profound observations both on animals and on human beings. And he found, among other things, that conditioning techniques applied to animals or humans in a state either of psychological or physical stress, sank in, so to say, very deeply into the mind body of the creature, and were extremely difficult to get rid of. So they seem to be embedded more deeply than other forms of conditioning. And this, of course, this fact, I think, was discovered empirically in the past. People did make use of many of these techniques. But the difference between the old empirical intuitive methods and our own methods is the difference between a sort of hit and miss craftsman's point of view and the genuinely scientific point of view. I mean, I think there is a real difference between ourselves and, say, the inquisitors of the 16th century. We know much more precisely what we are doing than they knew, and we can extend, because of our theoretical knowledge, we can extend what we are doing over a wider area with a greater assurance of producing something which really works. In this context, I would like to mention the extremely interesting chapters in Dr. William Sargent's Battle for the Mind, where he points out how intuitively some of the great religious teachers, leaders of the past, have hit on the Pavlovian method. He speaks specifically of Wesley's method of producing conversions, which were essentially based upon a technique of heightening psychological stress to the limit by talking about hellfire, and so making people extremely vulnerable to suggestion, and then suddenly releasing this stress by offering hopes of heaven. And this is a very interesting chapter, showing how completely, on purely intuitive and empirical grounds, a skilled natural psychologist, as Wesley was, could discover these Pavlovian methods. Well, as I say, we now know the reason why these techniques work, and there's no doubt at all that we can, if we want to, carry them much further than was possible in the past. And of course, in the recent history of brainwashing, both as applied to prisoners of war and to the lower personnel within the Communist Party in China, we see that the Pavlovian methods have been applied systematically and evidently with extraordinary efficacy. I mean, I think there can be no doubt that by the application of these methods, a very large army of totally devoted people has been created. The conditioning has been driven in, so to say, by kind of psychological iontophoresis into the very depths of people's being, and has got so deep that it's very difficult for it ever to be rooted out. And these methods, I think, are a real refinement on the older methods of terror, because they combine methods of terror with methods of acceptance, methods that the person who he is subjected to a form of terroristic stress, but for the purpose of inducing a kind of voluntary, quotes, acceptance of the state the psychological state into which he has been driven, and the state of affairs within which he finds himself. So that, as I say, there has been, I think, a definite improvement, shall we say, even in the techniques of terrorism. Well, then we come to the consideration of other techniques, of non-terroristic techniques for inducing consent and for inducing people to love their servitude. Here, I mean, I think we can, I don't think I can possibly go into all of them because I don't know all of them, but I mean, I can mention a few of the more obvious methods which can now be used and which are based upon recent scientific findings. First of all, there are the methods connected with straight suggestion and and hypnosis. I think we know much more about this subject than was known in the past. People, of course, have always known about suggestion, and although they didn't know the word hypnosis, they certainly practiced it in various ways. But we have, I think, a much greater knowledge of the subject than in the past, and we can make use of our knowledge in ways which I think the past was probably never able to make use of it. For example, one of the things we now know for certain is that there is, of course, an enormous, this has been always known, a very great difference between individuals in regard to their suggestibility. But we now, I think, know pretty clearly that it's a sort of statistical structure of a population in regard to its suggestibility. It's very interesting when you look at the findings in different fields. In the field of hypnosis, in the field of administering placebos, for example, in the field of general suggestion, in states of drowsiness or of light sleep, you will find the same sorts of orders of magnitude continually cropping up. You will find, for example, that the experienced hypnotists will tell one that the number of people, the percentage of people who can be hypnotized with the utmost facility, just like that, is about 20%. That about a corresponding number at the other end of the scale are very, very difficult or almost impossible to hypnotize, and that in between there lies a large mass of people who can, with more or less difficulty, be hypnotized, that they can gradually to work hard enough at it, be got into the hypnotic state. And in the same way, the same sort of figures crop up again, for example, in relation to the administration of placebos. There was a big experiment was carried out 3 or 4 years ago in the General Hospital in Boston on post-operative cases where several hundred men and women suffering comparable kinds of pain after serious operations were given injections whenever they asked for them, whenever the pain got bad, and the injections 50% of the time were of morphine, 50% of the time were of distilled water. And about 20% of those who went through the experiment, about 20% of them got just as much relief from the distilled water as from the morphine. About 20% got no relief from the distilled water, and in between were those who got some relief or got relief occasionally. So here again we see the same sort of distribution. And similarly with regard to what in Brave New World I call hypnopedia, which is the sleep teaching. I was talking not long ago to a man who manufactures records which people can listen to during the light part of sleep. These are records for getting rich, for sexual satisfaction, for confidence in salesmanship and so on. And he said it's very interesting that these records are sold on a money-back basis, and he says that there is regularly between 15 and 20% of people who write indignantly saying the records don't work at all, and he sends the money back at once. There are, on the other hand, there are some, over 20% who write enthusiastically, saying they're now much richer, their sexual life is much better, etc., etc. And these, of course, are the dream clients, and they buy more of these records. And then in between are those who complain they're not getting much results, and they have to have letters written to them saying, well, go persist, my dear, go on, and you'll get there, and they generally do get results in the long run. Well, as I say, on the basis of this, I think we see quite clearly that the human population can be categorized according to their suggestibility fairly clearly. I suspect very strongly that this 20% is the same in all these cases. And I suspect also that it would not be at all difficult to recognize in very early childhood who were those who were extremely suggestible, who were those who were extremely unsuggestible, and who were those who occupied the intermediate space. Quite clearly, if everybody were extremely unsuggestible, organized society would be quite impossible. And if everybody were extremely suggestible, then dictatorship would be absolutely inevitable. I mean, it's very fortunate we have people who are moderately suggestible in the majority, and who therefore preserve us from dictatorship, but do permit organized society to be formed. But once given the fact that there are these 20% of highly suggestible people, it becomes quite clear that this is a matter of enormous political importance. For example, any demagogue who is able to get hold of a large number of these 20% of suggestible people and to organize them is really in a position to overthrow any government in any country. And I mean, I think this, after all, we've had the most incredible example in recent years of what can be done by efficient methods of suggestion and persuasion in the form of Hitler. Anybody who's read, for example, Bullock's Life of Hitler comes forth from this with a sort of horrified admiration for this infernal genius who really understood human weaknesses, I think, almost better than anybody, and who exploited them with all the resources then available. I mean, he knew everything. I mean, for example, he knew intuitively this Pavlovian truth that conditioning installed in a state of stress or fatigue, it goes much deeper than conditioning installed at other times. This was why all his big speeches were organized at night. He speaks of this quite frankly, of course, in Mein Kampf. He said this was done solely because people are tired at night and therefore are much less capable of resisting persuasion than they would be during the day. And in all his techniques, he was using, he had discovered intuitively and by trial and error a great many of the weaknesses which we now know about in a sort of scientific way, I think much more clearly than he did. But the fact remains that this differential suggestibility, this susceptibility to hypnosis, I do think is something which has to be considered very carefully in relation to any kind of thought about democratic government. I mean, if there are 20% of the people who can really be suggested into believing almost anything, which evidently they can be, then we have to take extremely careful steps to prevent the rise of demagogues who will drive them on into extreme positions and then organize them into very, very dangerous armies, private armies, which may overthrow the government. So this, as I say, is in this field of pure persuasion. I think we do know much more than we did in the past, and obviously we now have mechanisms for multiplying the demagogue's voice and image in a quite hallucinatory way. I mean, the television and the radio, Hitler was making enormous use of the radio. He could speak to millions of people simultaneously. I mean, this alone, of course, creates an enormous gulf between the modern and the ancient demagogue. And the ancient demagogue could only appeal to as many people as his voice could reach by yelling at his utmost. But the modern demagogue can touch literally millions at a time. And of course, with his multiplication of his image, he can produce this kind of hallucinatory effect, which is of enormous hypnotic and suggestive importance. But then there are the various other methods which one can think of, which have, thank heaven, as yet not been used, but which obviously could be used. There is, for example, the pharmacological method. This was one of the things I talked about in Brave New World. I invented a hypothetical drug called Soma, which of course would not exist as it stood there, because it was simultaneously a stimulant, a narcotic, and a hallucinogen, which seems unlikely in one substance. But the point is that if you applied several different substances, you could get almost all these results even now. And the really interesting thing about the new chemical substances, the new mind-changing drugs, is this, that whereas if you look back into history, it's clear that man has always had a hankering after mind-changing chemicals. He has always desired to take holidays from himself. But and this is the most extraordinary fact of all, is that every naturally occurring stimulant, narcotic, sedative, or hallucinogen was discovered before the dawn of history. I don't think there's one single one of these naturally occurring ones which modern science has discovered. Modern science, of course, has discovered better ways of extracting the active principles from these drugs, and, of course, has discovered numerous ways of synthesizing new substances of extreme power. But the actual discovery of these naturally occurring things was made by primitive man, goodness knows how many centuries ago. There is, for example, underneath the lake dwellings, the early Neolithic lake dwellings which have been dug up in Switzerland, we find poppy heads, which looks as though people were already using this most ancient and powerful and most dangerous of narcotics, even in the days before the rise of agriculture. So that man was apparently a dope addict before he was a farmer, which is a very, very curious comment on human nature. But the difference, as I say, between the ancient mind changers, the traditional mind changers, and these new substances, is that they were extremely harmful, and the new ones are not. I mean, even the permissible mind changer, alcohol, is not entirely harmless, as people may have noticed. And the other ones, the non-permissible ones, such as opium and cocaine, opium and all its derivatives, are very harmful indeed. They rapidly produce addiction, and in some cases lead at an extraordinary rate to physical degeneration and death. Whereas these new substances, this is really very extraordinary. The number of these new mind-changing substances can produce enormous revolutions within the mental side of our being, and yet do almost nothing to the physiological side. I mean, you can have an enormous revolution, for example, with LSD-25, or with the newly synthesized drug psilocybin, which is the active principle of the Mexican sacred mushroom. You can have this enormous mental revolution with no more physiological revolution than you would get from drinking 2 cocktails. And this is really a most extraordinary fact. And it is, of course, true that pharmacologists are producing a great many wonder drugs, where the cure is almost worse than the disease. Every new edition of the medical textbooks contains a longer and longer chapter on what are called iatrogenic diseases, that is to say, diseases caused by doctors. And this is quite true, that many of the wonder drugs are extremely dangerous. I mean, they can produce extraordinary effects, and in critical conditions they should certainly be used, but they should be used with the utmost caution. But there is evidently a whole class of drugs affecting the central nervous system, which can produce enormous changes in sedation, in euphoria, in energizing the whole mental process. without doing any perceptible harm to the body. And in this sense, this represents, it seems to me, the most extraordinary revolution, that it is in the hands of a dictator. These substances of one kind or another could be used in the most with complete, first of all, with complete harmlessness, and the result would be that you can imagine a euphoric which would make people thoroughly happy even in the most abominable circumstances. These things are possible. This is the extraordinary thing. After all, this has even been true with the crudo drugs. As a houseman years ago remarked apropos of Milton's Paradise Lost, he said, and beer does more than Milton can to justify God's ways to man. And beer is, of course, an extremely crude drug compared with these ones, and you can certainly say that some of the psychic energizers and the new hallucinants can do incomparably more than Milton and all the theologians combined could possibly do to make the terrifying mystery of our existence seem more tolerable than it does. So that here, I think one has an enormous area in which the ultimate revolution could function very well indeed. An area in which a great deal of control could be used by not through terror, but through making life seem much more enjoyable than it normally does. Enjoyable to the point where, as I said before, human beings come to love a state of things which by any reasonable and decent human standard they ought not to love. And this, I think, is perfectly possible. But then, very briefly, let me speak about one of the more recent developments in the sphere of neurology, the implantation of electrodes in the brain. This, of course, has been done on a large scale in animals, and in a few cases it's been done in cases of the hopelessly insane. And it is, anybody who's watched the behavior of rats with electrodes planted in different centers must come away from this experience with the most extraordinary doubts about what on earth is in store for us if ever this is got hold of by a dictator. I saw not long ago some rats in Magoon's laboratory at UCLA. There were two sets of them, one with electrodes planted in a pleasure center. And these rats, the technique was that they had a bar which they pressed and which turned on a very small current for a short space of time, which we had a wire connected with that electrode, and which stimulated this pleasure center, which was evidently absolutely ecstatic, but these rats were pressing the bar 18,000 times a day. Apparently, if you kept them from pressing the bar for a day, they would press the bar 36,000 times on the following day, and would fall till they fell down in complete exhaustion. And they would neither eat nor be interested in the opposite sex, and would just go on pressing the bar. Then the most extraordinary rats were those where the electrode was planted halfway between a pleasure and a pain center, and where evidently the result was a kind of mixture of the most wonderful ecstasy and being on the rack at the same time. And you would see the rat sort of looking at its bar and sort of saying to be or not to be, that is the question. Finally would approach and then with this awful, if I can humanize, anthropomorphize, he was feeling something terribly mixed, and he would wait for quite a long time before pressing the bar again, but he would always press it again. This is the extraordinary thing. I noticed in this most recent issue of Scientific American, there's a very interesting article on electrodes in the brains of chickens, where the technique is very ingenious. You sink into their brain a little socket with a screw on it, and the electrodes then can be screwed deeper and deeper into the brain stem, and you can test at any moment, according to the depth that it goes in fractions of a millimeter, of what you're stimulating. And these creatures are not merely stimulated by wire. They are fitted with a miniaturized radio receiver weighing less than an ounce, which is attached to them, so that they can be communicated with at a distance. I mean, they can run about in the barnyard, and you can press the button, and this particular area of the brain which the electrode's been screwed down to will be stimulated, and you will get these fantastic phenomena that a sleepy chicken will suddenly get up and rush about, or an active chicken will suddenly sit down and go to sleep, or a hen will suddenly start sitting as though it were hatching out an egg, or a rooster will start fighting, or will suddenly go into a state of extreme depression. The whole picture of the absolute control of the drive is terrifying. And in the few cases in which this has been done with very sick human beings, the effects are evidently very remarkable too. I was talking last summer to, in England, to Grey Walter, who is the most eminent exponent of the electroencephalogram techniques in England, and he was telling me that he's seen hopeless inmates of asylums with these things in their heads, and these people were suffering from uncontrollable depression, and they'd had the electrodes inserted into something resembling evidently the pleasure center of the rat. Anyhow, when they felt too bad, they just pressed the button in the battery in their pocket, and he said to the doctor, "It's fantastic, the mouth that was down would suddenly turn up, and they would evidently feel, I don't know how long at a time, very cheerful and happy." So that here again one sees as the most extraordinary revolutionary techniques which are now available to us. Now, I think what is obviously perfectly clear is that for the present these techniques are not being much used except in a purely experimental way. But I think it is extraordinarily important for us to realize to realize what is happening, to make ourselves acquainted with what had already happened, and then to use a certain amount of imagination to extrapolate into the future the sort of things that might happen. I mean, what might happen if these fantastically powerful techniques were used by unscrupulous people in authority? What on earth would happen? What sort of society would we get? And I think this is peculiarly important because as one sees, looking back over history, we have allowed in the past all those advances in technology which have profoundly changed the social and individual life. We've allowed them to take us by surprise. I mean, it seems to me that during the late 18th century, early 19th century, when the new machines were making possible the factory system, it was not beyond the wit of man to see to look at what was happening and to project into the future, and maybe to forestall the really dreadful consequences which plagued England and most of Western Europe and most of this country for about 50 or 60 years, the horrible abuses of the factory system. And if a certain amount of forethought had been devoted to the problem at that time, if people had first of all found out what was happening and then used their imagination to see what might happen, and then had gone on to work out means by which the worst applications of the new techniques should not take place, and then I think Western humanity might have been spared about 3 generations of utter misery which was imposed upon the poor at that time. And Similarly with various technological advances now. I mean, it's quite clear we have to start thinking very, very hard about the problems of automation. And again, I think we have to think still more profoundly about the problems which may arise in relation to these new techniques, which may contribute to this ultimate revolution. Our business is to, first of all, as I say, to be aware of what is happening, then to use our imagination to see what might happen, how this might be abused, and then, if possible, to see the enormous powers which we now possess, thanks to these scientific and technological advances, shall be used for the benefit of human beings and not for their ultimate degradation. Thank you.
Well, you've listened to one of the men who were put out by the Tavistock Institute and the big universities of England to promote ideas of a form of happiness, as they called it, the disguise of happiness for humanity by the use of drugs, chemical means, and even electronic brain stimulation. When he talks about the poor suffering, etc., the people, the masses, you've got to understand this man was brought up amongst elitist circles who see themselves as the good shepherds, the more evolved creatures looking over the lesser evolved of the masses in a not too unfriendly fashion. That's how it appears to them. That's how they rationalize it, basically. So when he's talking about to end misery and suffering, it's kind of like a farmer looking at his flock of sheep who are upset over something. It's the same sort of way. He's not really looking at individuals in personal distress over something that they should maybe perhaps be concerned about. He's rather looking at ways to keep them placid and happy, and that will solve everyone's problems, the controllers or the shepherds, and the masses. If you can't think and worry about something, then you don't have to do any worrying. You're incapable of worrying, in fact, if your brain's been all fogged up with chemicals and you're being controlled by a small elite. He just doesn't see anything wrong with this. The big controllers, he was one of many, of course, who were put out there, all from the same source, all with the same vision of a future which would end all war, all conflict by standardizing a mass mindset. The Borg mentality, you might say, that was the solution to everything. And I guess they're right in that sense. They will have no more problems from the little boys at the bottom if each little boy and girl has no mind of their own to use. So it's up to you to take this information, analyze it, study the time period it was written in, by the institutions that it came from, by the big university-funded programs, funded again by the big foundations, to do intense study and research into human behavior, basically mass human behavior, mass psychology. And you'll get some frightening answers as to what they dreamed up. And then you'll see that what they dreamed up has been implemented into your own life. People are chasing all kinds of things today which are conjured up by communications industries and media and entertainment. They're chasing phantoms, you might say, phantoms in the air. Forms created purely out of imagination with cunningness, of course, using archetypal type symbolism, which everyone reacts to. It's a good example is the reptilian agenda. Sold lots of books. Started really with a series on television called V, a well-funded series about these creatures and UFOs, of course, coming down to Earth, and they're under their partly human skin. They're actually reptile people who eat mice and rats and things. That prepared the groundwork. As Albert Pike said, they always lay the foundation first and build on it. Out comes eventually another man with his own interpretation of the Sumerian tablets. A unique interpretation that's kind of laughed at by politer circles who have done more research than he has and who have no spin to take. And then that's built upon by other authors put out from the same sources to then build on it. But the foundation is faulty. It's the V, you see. If you understand what the V symbol actually means, you'll start to understand why they call things these particular names. So the V series came first, put the foundation there of possibility thinking. Out comes the unique interpretation to build on it. Then come the authors with repetition. They call that a form of psychic driving, as they used in MK Ultra. And of course, they seem to think it's real by the much speaking, as they say. The more they say it, the more it becomes real. Huxley himself talks about the use of repetition to get things across. As did Lord Bertrand Russell on the impact of science on society. Repetition and repetition without basis, you see, gets the message across no matter how fantastic it is. So ponder this. That is all for now. Good night, and may your God go with you.